So again, welcome everyone to our webinar tonight called Teaching Critical Thinking to Young Students Through the C3 Framework. I have really enjoyed learning a lot about that C3 framework. However, we're not using it in our system right now. I want to welcome our speaker today, Miss Julie Holland. She has been teaching now for 17 years as a middle and high school English instructor in Alabama and now Missouri. She has her master's in administration and her secondary principal certification and a K-12 reading certificate. She's currently in her 7th year with the St. Louis Public Schools as an instructional coach and literacy specialist, currently working in the elementary setting. So thank you so much, Julie, again for being here. I'm going to let you take over.
Great. Thank you, Melissa, for helping me today in this presentation, and thank you everyone for joining us for what I hope to be a nice quick session of learning together and thinking about the C3 framework and how we can foster that inquiry in the elementary classroom. So if you look on the board, it just says tonight's objectives. We're going to hope that we grow in our understanding of the inquiry model and in how to teach that critical thinking through the 4 dimensions of that C3 framework. So I want you to just look at this for a minute. There's a quote pulled from the C3 framework itself. It says, children and adolescents are naturally curious, and they are especially curious about the complex and multifaceted world they inhabit. So my question for us, and you can post in the chat if you feel like it, the question is, if students are just naturally curious about their world, why does it seem that so many students, especially by the time they get to middle school and high school, why is it that they seem to dislike social studies? If you have a thought and you'd like to share that in the chat, go ahead and do that now. And Melissa, I'm not seeing the chat, so if you want to call some out as you see them, that'd be great. Or if anybody wants to share, that'd be wonderful.
Absolutely. And I checked, I think everybody was able to find the chat, but if you're having any trouble, it should be in the bottom or top. If you scroll up to where you see now viewing Julie Holland's screen, you could find the chat box there. So we do have a comment, they become disengaged and can't make real world connections.
Great. I'll agree with that. I'm sure everybody on here would. And as you guys are posting and thinking, I'll share with you what I was thinking when I read this. So if you think back to your best and then your worst social studies or history experiences and classes you ever had, I want you to think about what was the difference. Well, when I think back to when I was younger and I think back to social studies classes, it was a lot of just textbook reading and answering questions at the end of the chapter, right? But I want to share an experience that my now 20-year-old son had, and it was a very different experience for him. As a 4th grader, he had a wonderful social studies teacher who crafted his lessons like a storyteller would. And Blake loved his teacher and absolutely loved these stories. He couldn't wait for it every day. So much so that one day my 4th grader came in from school with this very serious look on his face, and he said, Mom, Dad, I need you to sit down. Well, we sat down at the kitchen table. We said, Blake, what is it? He said, did you know that the United States almost had a 3rd World War? And I'm thinking, well, now I've been at school all day. Maybe I missed the news. What in the world happened? Well, thankfully, after a few minutes, what we realized was that he wanted to share with us about the Cuban Missile Crisis. But he had taken that so to heart because of the way that his teacher had crafted that story. He couldn't wait to come home and tell us both about it. So when I think about those 2 different experiences, to me, I think it has to be in the delivery. Someone said engagement. Someone said that we have to make it feel like real world application. Melissa, did anybody else have a chance to post in the chat?
Yes, so topics covered are too old and they struggle with connections.
Mm-hmm.
And in high school, it tends to be more history and boring reading.
Exactly. But again, if you think about that story I just shared with you, here's my fourth grader telling me about the Cuban Missile Crisis. So somehow that wonderful fourth grade teacher was able to make something that was old history and could have been a very boring, dry little chapter in a history book come to life for him. So we have to think about that and how things are put in front of our children. If you think about what's here on the slide for a minute, we know that our instructional practices matter. The kids, as it says, don't need to be Google. They don't need to just regurgitate any information anymore, but they need to learn how to command it. And if we think about, again, it says research indicates that students who read more than just textbooks, write more about their learning, and have multiple opportunities to discuss their ideas with their peers, outperform their peers in more traditional instructional models, almost without fail. So in the last 10 years, the National Council for Social Studies developed this framework that envisions the purpose and the instructional practices of social studies education in the United States. So when students do a quick Google search for any basic information, they no longer need us to be the wealth of information. They don't need us to provide all the answers for them. They can go find the answers. We need, as educators, to help them apply that content knowledge to answer the age-old question, why do I need to know this? So we have to make it count for them. Again, somebody mentioned engaging. It has to feel important.
And Michelle Kimpson added.
So again, when you think about, I'm sorry, Melissa, yes?
I think there was a
when
delay.
we think about the C3 framework, yes. The C3 framework represents this approach to this instructional planning that moves away from that old textbook coverage to instructional practices that really do try to get them engaged through what's called an inquiry arc. And the heart of that arc is the use of questions to spark that curiosity, guide their instruction, deepen their investigations, acquire that content, and then again, apply everything that they're learning to real world settings. And ultimately, our hope would be to become active and engaged citizens. Take what you know and use it in a meaningful, productive way. So let's think for a minute what that word inquiry means. If we're thinking we're going to work in an inquiry arc, we're going to plan inquiries, really what is an inquiry? Well, an inquiry invites students to explore academic content by posing questions, investigating to find the answers, and then doing something with that new understanding. That's really it. Here's the question. Let me find out about it, and then what do I do with this information when I'm done? But what we want to know, what's really important here, is that the skills that they're acquiring during that inquiry are just about as important as actually finding the answer. So those skills such as comparing and contrasting, organizing your thoughts, analyzing things that are in front of you, questioning information that's put in front of you, and then even critiquing it as they get older. All of those things developed through this research process, again, are just as important. Those skills are just as important as the content knowledge that's gained during that research. So the inquiry arc of the C3 framework has these 4 dimensions that move students from developing questions to using these tools of social studies to evaluate sources, to support their ideas with solid evidence, and then communicate their ideas, and they're taking informed action either in their school or moving on out into their community. So tonight, what we're going to do is just quickly, like the little tip of the iceberg for tonight, quickly look at the rationale behind each dimension. Why does this inquiry arc make sense? And then we're going to look at some of the suggestions for how to implement this in the classroom. So the why and then the how we might start doing this. And we're going to just kind of throw in some examples of what these dimensions might look like on the teacher's end and the student's end. So we're going to start with dimension 1, which is developing questions and planning inquiries, where the arc begins. And we're going to spend maybe a little more time in this dimension than others, again, because it's laying the foundation for everything that's going to happen in this inquiry. And Melissa's going to help me remember to take a breath when we get to the end of each dimension. And as we're going, if you all have questions you want to pop into that chat, when we get to the end of the dimension and we're ready to start the next one, we can take a quick look and see if there's anything that we want to answer before we move on. So again, the creators of the C3 framework provide the rationale behind the inquiry arc for learning. It supports the students' naturally creative personalities and their urge to seek out answers to questions. And so if they're going to do that naturally, that's just part of who they are as young learners. Our job is then to actually help guide them and show them how to discipline their thinking processes. So not to tell them what the answers are, not to tell them how to think, but to help them use different strategies for thinking. And then again, use that information in new ways as active citizens. So again, we're just going to help guide them in something that they should be doing naturally as learners. So how can we do this? We're going to just, again, look at briefly some of the critical moves that we need to do in the first part of the inquiry. Number 1, we have to develop strong, compelling questions for your inquiry, just one. Then we want to take that compelling question and think about what are the supporting questions that we're going to ask, or as our older students might ask, that are going to build the content knowledge that they need to answer that big compelling question. Next, we need to determine what primary and secondary sources that our students are going to use to answer those supporting questions. And when possible, we always want to involve our students in that process. That's a little bit easier with the kids in the older elementary grades than it is with our younger ones. But you know, again, out of their natural curiosity, they're going to come up with questions as they get into any particular deep, compelling question. All right, again, the heart of the matter in dimension 1 is that compelling question. I love this thought. If we start with the big questions, the little ones will follow. We'll figure out what we have to ask, what we have to know to answer the big question. But if we start with the little questions, those are usually those content knowledge questions, that's usually where we end, because there's no reason for them to take that knowledge and apply it to any bigger concept. We haven't given them something else to aim for. If we just put out questions that are content-based and they've answered it, they can check that box and they feel like they're done. So we want to keep growing through that content knowledge. So let's think about what actually makes a question compelling. Now, I know that in a lot of our curriculum, we don't see the word compelling. We see what are called essential questions, and that's something we want to know. But a compelling question has to satisfy these two conditions. First, it has to be intellectually meaty. In other words, it needs to reflect that enduring issue. This is kind of the same as an essential question. It has to reflect that enduring issue or concern or a debate in social studies, and it has to draw on multiple disciplines. We have to look at it from multiple lenses for it to really be a compelling question, multiple perspectives. And secondly, it has to be student-friendly. So by student-friendly, a question that reflects some quality or condition that we know students care about and that honors and respects their intellectual efforts. This is something that they could do and answer on their own. Student-friendly, age-appropriate, but something that they want to know about their world, but that requires some knowledge, some new knowledge. It's not just an opinion they're throwing out there. They have to find some supporting evidence to answer their thoughts on that compelling question. Now, let's think for a minute. When we think about the kind of questions we're putting out there, if we're thinking, am I creating a compelling question or am I creating a content-based question? Sometimes it feels like that's a little murky. These are ways you can check yourself. First of all, if you already know the answer you want to hear from your students, you don't have a compelling question. There should be some debate as to what the quote-unquote correct answer is. You probably have a content-based question if you already know the answer you expect to hear. And those are the ones that are great that we use to check for their understanding. Both are valuable, but they have different purposes. So again, if we don't have those content-based questions that build background knowledge, then students can't do the type of deeper thinking that is required to make that informed opinion to answer that compelling question. And again, one of the earliest standards for social studies is that students will be able to sort fact from opinion and then use those facts to, again, support an opinion that they are creating. So the next thing we have to do is, again, we've created the compelling question. We probably now have some curriculum, content-based supporting questions that we think will help our kids really think deeply and from different perspectives on this compelling question. But now for our younger kids, I would say it's time for us to pull sources. Again, as they get older, maybe our 4th and 5th graders, sometimes our 3rd graders by the end of the year, maybe they can help find some of those sources they want to use. But this is where we have to be careful to get just the right balance of sources. Too many, and they just become bogged down in trying to get through everything that you put in front of them to read. Too much work. That's where their brain power is going. And that's where their focus goes. Not enough, they probably still don't have enough to pull together to actually answer the compelling question. So we want their focus to be about immersing themselves in the content, and we want them to get to the point where they can research and vet their own sources to support their claims. But again, probably at this elementary level, we're going to take time to actually curate and vet and lead them carefully through those sources so they can develop a critical lens. That's a big part of our job still with our young learners. Now, that's again not to say that we don't involve our students. We really do want to hear their voices in this work. It's important for them to feel like they have a voice, They may come up with a supporting question that you hadn't even considered. So always at least give them the opportunity to pose those questions, whether you decide that it's a rabbit hole that you don't want to go down, or it's worth the time and effort for you to say, you know, I hadn't thought about that. I'm going to see what resources I can find to help us answer that question. That's where you come in, and again, guiding them in that thinking that says, let's stay on task. That's an interesting question, but it's not going to help us answer this compelling question, or maybe it is. So again, get them in there, get them involved, generate that list, guide them to think about it. And again, always ask them, is that question going to help us answer our bigger compelling question? If they can support that idea, then that's where we come in to help them find how they're going to get their answers. Again, we want them engaged in it, and we want them to explore their own wonderings whenever it's possible, because then it becomes even more meaningful. I'm not just reading because my teacher says I have to read this. It's something I wanted to know. It's a question I had that I now want to find the answer to. That's where we want our kids thinking whenever possible. So the work behind that, you've come up with an idea. What would all of this look like if you wanted to put this on a template? And I think this is a wonderful template, by the way. If you haven't gone to the c3teachers.org website, there is a blank template there where you can build your own inquiries. And there are also ones just like this example from 5th grade that are already designed for you. So let's just kind of take a look at what we're seeing here. You'll notice, oh, my arrows aren't showing very well here. So where is that compelling question? Right there at the top, right? How did sugar feed slavery? Wow. For 5th grade, I think I would want to know that. This is not something I've ever researched. How did sugar feed slavery? So there's our compelling question. Then we want to look at the 3 supporting questions. You'll see those down below. What conditions drove sugar production? That's content. We have to go out and find that information to know where we're going. The second one, how was sugar cultivated? The third one, what was life like for enslaved Africans on sugar plantations in the Western Hemisphere? Fascinating research that's going to drive us to answer how sugar fed slavery. And you can see then, if you'll see the formative performance tests are there. That's not quite part of this first part of the inquiry, but that's coming later. But you do see that we have some nice curated sources now that the teacher has taken time to research that we know will help them answer these supporting questions that we feel will help them move in that direction to answer that compelling question. And so again, a nice stream of thought. It doesn't mean that we can't add sources along the way if we discover something else out there waiting for us. And again, if you do visit the C3 Teachers website, and I'll take you again to that later, you could see this whole inquiry developed from beginning to end, and it includes that final performance task as well. So that's that first dimension where a lot of that deep thinking and planning on our part has to take place. We've got a compelling question. Did we think of the right supporting questions? Did we find sources that we think are going to push our kids in the right direction? That's the work in the first dimension of the inquiry. So did anybody have anything they wanted to post in the chat? We'll take a breath. Anything we want to share? And if not, we'll move on to the second part, the second dimension. Good?
I think we're good for
right. All right. Yes?
We're good.
Okay. So again, if you think of them later, just continue to share in that chat. And if we don't answer them immediately, we'll get to them, I promise. So once you've now developed this compelling question, you've got your supporting questions. Now it's time in the second dimension to consider how we're going to help students approach these. That's the work of dimension 2. Oh, There are my arrows. All right. So when we think about dimension 2 and the why, I want you to think for just a minute. As adults, we shift our thinking lens constantly during the day, depending on the task that's in front of us. So am I approaching a problem from a parent lens? Am I approaching a problem in front of me and problem solving from an educator lens or from a consumer lens? And so that's something that we've learned to do over time. And it's natural then that we want to start helping our students understand that we can look at a problem from different lenses, different perspectives, and that's going to help us understand a problem in a much deeper way. We might then, if we just went out with one thought in mind. And since we know that they can often have the tendency to become very wrapped up in less productive ideas, again, our support in Dimension 2, helping them pick which lenses or tools of social studies to view a problem, that's going to help us teach them how to develop their understanding and their richer ideas. So we want to steer them away from the things that are, again, extraneous, that can often lead us in the wrong direction. We want to help them narrow their focus by thinking about how to approach a problem or a question. So what we're really doing is helping students develop what in Dimension 2 we might think of as habits of mind. How am I looking at things? How am I approaching a question using one or more tools of social studies? And when we look, if you look at these descriptors, these are the tools of social studies. We've got civics, economics, geography, and history, and then all of the components that build those up. Those look really intimidating if we think about younger students, right? How am I ever going to teach causation and argumentation to a third grader, or the global economy, or exchange and markets? Those seem very daunting. But I want to show you this. I thought this is a great resource to have. It's an article, again, that you'll find in the C3 website. And in this article, that details the process that an elementary school actually went through to implement the C3 framework. These two authors, Marston and Handel, offer these one-word descriptors, or what we might call attributes, of those 4 disciplines and tools of social studies to make them more accessible for younger students. So when we think of this, okay, I look at civics, well, I can teach the concept of rules to elementary kids. That seems comfortable. Can we teach in economics? Can we teach kids about money and jobs or goods and services? Absolutely. And in geography, about boundaries or regions on the map. And then in history, cause and effect, or geography, or just basic people who are important to know in history. Absolutely. So now that we think of it this way, suddenly these tools of social studies that we're going to use don't seem so daunting. So let's think about the application of Dimension 2. Analyzing documents with a purpose. That's going to be key. Moving from noticing and wondering to actually mining for gold. Thinking about, again, once students really understand why they're using a document and what they hope to find because they have a question they're trying to answer, suddenly the analysis of those documents becomes so much more intentional. It's just not, this is what I see. What do you know? We all do those noticing and wondering strategies. What do you notice? What do you wonder? Isn't that vague when you think about it? It's an interesting way to see what's going on in their minds, but if you really want them to be able to analyze something, they need to know why they're looking at it, what they hope to find, why they're considering that. So again, this is where we want to use those habits of mind to begin analyzing those documents. And again, analysis is just that foundation. So we want them to become more intentional. We're teaching them to become intentional about the way they approach work that's in front of them. So how do we do that? Again, carefully craft those supporting questions so that students have opportunities to explore a topic from more than just one expert lens. So in that preview, we had to see more than just a historical version of why sugar supported slavery, right? We had to look at that from an economic lens, from a historical lens. So give them that opportunity to grow in different ways. Use a variety, again, that explore it from different perspectives. And finally, make available and model the use of graphic organizers to guide those students' gathering of information. So again, if you look at that Dimension 2 section, here's a compelling question that's actually from the Young Citizens program. This is, what makes a town? All right, that's our compelling question. We have supporting question number 1 that requires our students to think about civics. They have to think about what a town government does and how laws are made. The second supporting question to be able to think about really what makes a town is all about geography and economics. Why do we choose to live in a certain place? That's kind of the geography. And how does a town get goods and services? We can't have a town if we can't have goods and services. And then, again, a third supporting question makes them take another lens when they ask, what are different towns like? How do our surroundings affect our lives? We have to look at geography and economics again. So each supporting question covers a content knowledge standard for a grade 1 student, but it's going to help them, again, fully answer the compelling question after they've built their background knowledge by doing the research and the reading. So just some final thoughts on that dimension. Again, primary source analysis can support deeper understanding of compelling questions for students when viewed through the social studies lens. Now, read as I read, just think through this. Or, there's a big or here. When viewed through a strategic lens, students are able to use documents to create more compelling and supporting questions. Right? Isn't that an interesting way that works for us? It's like the chicken or the egg. It's sometimes difficult to really determine which one comes first. We think we know where we're going, but then it's that idea of inquiry. Finding what we thought was the answer we were looking for is not always the most important part. It's, what am I learning on that journey? How am I learning to research? How am I learning to switch gears and switch thoughts if I'm not finding what I thought I was going to find? It's okay. It's okay if we don't find that. It's okay if we change and we ask more questions. So again, are the documents supporting the understanding, or is the understanding then helping us want to ask more questions? All right, so in Dimension 3, it's time. Yes?
We did have a question for you.
Okay, I hope I can answer it.
It was actually from earlier, but I had read it wrong and didn't realize she wanted to know. And when I went back, okay, so last year, Adriana taught 4th grade and they loved it. So how does she use social studies and history to motivate them to do more reading? She did find out that when they have something to say, they like to write about it. So she wants more ways to trigger curiosity.
So again, you're right on point. Again, I think the key is in those supporting documents that you can send them to. If you're wanting to support reading in social studies, it's a perfect time to support reading. You can do those small breakout groups, reading different documents or supporting things. And remember that when we're researching, everything isn't just a document. We can listen to songs from a particular era. We can look at maps. We can read poetry. We can read biographies or primary sources of diary journals and entries, anything like that. Really, I think kids find fascinating when they see the world from a different set of eyes that might have been from 100 years ago. So all of those things help support and then keep them engaged in the reading. And then let's see, Melissa, I think there was another part of that question. I'm not sure if I veered off course or not.
Triggering curiosity in the students.
And again, I think it is in the variety of documents and sources that you put in front of them. So it's not just that textbook. That textbook can be that foundation. And how fascinating is it to pull in something unusual? You know, look at photographs. Kids love exploring photographs as well. So always think about all those things. It doesn't feel like reading necessarily, but it is literacy. And what we want to promote is that well-rounded literacy component. So understanding how to navigate a photograph, a diary journal, all those things are components of literacy too. And they find them engaging. And building those inquiries. So especially if you have students who are maybe reluctant readers, giving them things that aren't heavy in reading, but are rich in content, and asking who's missing in this picture. If you're looking at a picture and you don't see any minorities in that picture, you know, asking those culturally relevant questions, make them think about that a little bit. Whose voice is missing in this article? Who did we not hear from? When you had, you know, our fourth graders study the women's right to vote, and looking at those primary sources, hearing from the women, seeing how women were treated during that time, it's fascinating to them. So again, I think the more you curate those sources, the more engaging it becomes. If you find them engaging, they're probably going to find them engaging too. And then let them ask those questions. And thank you for posing that question. If I didn't quite answer it, I'll keep thinking for you. All right, so we've built the compelling question. We've done the supporting questions. We've thought about what content knowledge we feel is important. And again, that goes right back to those standards. What do they have to know in whatever grade level you're teaching, right? We have to get that in there. Where's that content knowledge, and what sources are we going to use? That's the work we've been doing, and which tools of social studies they need to be able to answer that compelling question. So in dimension 3, now we're moving to evaluating sources and teaching children how to use their evidence. So again, if we think about the why, we think about what sound opinions are. We want to teach children to voice sound opinions. And in this day and age, I think anybody who does social media knows that there are a lot of opinions out there, and not all of them are sound, right? So one of the central principles in this C3 framework rests on that concept of evidence, 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 evidence. And isn't that an ELA standard that we teach constantly? Support your idea with evidence. And usually we say from the text, right? You can't just say that's what you think. Where do you find supporting evidence for it? Understanding is achieved by that careful investigation of the questions, the data collection, the reading, the analysis, the synthesis. In effect, the data are transformed then into evidence-based claims. And this is where, again, we want our children to learn at an early age to start separating opinions and conjecture from justifiable understandings. I have a justifiable understanding because I have some content knowledge that I can use as a critical thinker to support my answer. And again, we also want in this moment to teach our children about digital literacy. Again, ideas are in front of them constantly from every point of view. They're a mouse click away, and they need more than ever to know how and learn how to keep learning in order to cultivate sound understandings. If I read something as an adult learner and I think, I'm not sure if I agree with that or not, I'd like to know why they had that opinion or how they came to that, I know I need to go find that evidence. We know we don't want our children taking everything at face value, and that's our job here. So again, in the why of this dimension, we're teaching those students, support your ideas with evidence. You can have that opinion and no one has to agree with you, but you do have to have some supporting evidence to back your ideas. And again, we want to teach them how to ask the right questions about the sources. Ask the right questions about the sources. Children are, I don't want to say gullible, but they assume that if it's something that's in print or that somebody put out there, it must be true, right? We want to, again, make them think about asking the right questions. Who did this? What is their background? What is their knowledge? Help them navigate this really big world, right? It's heavy, heavy, heavy in info more than ever, and that's a lot for them to navigate on their own. So one of the best ways that we can start helping students, again, kind of mine for that gold and understand and ask the questions that they need to be asking about things that are in front of them is to teach them how to use graphic organizers and organize their questions, dig for the answers. So these three are from the Library of Congress and the National Archives. They are great resources. They are full of organizers and from a variety of primary source documents. Again, you'll notice that one of these is for a document. One is to analyze a sound recording. Listen to that and ask the right questions. And the one at the top is how to analyze a photograph in a meaningful way. Again, this is going beyond just noticing and wondering. This gets them to be asking and thinking about critical questions. Again, if you look at that, use it as historical evidence. Is it accurate? You know, it's so easy to Photoshop things. How would you know if it's an accurate photo you're looking at anymore? So help them organize their thoughts, learn how to ask the right questions by one of the best ways, again, graphic organizers. And finally, in Dimension 4, they're taking all of that they've learned, all that they've thought about. They have evidence, they've read, they've shared, they've collaborated, we hope. They've taken time to talk to one another because that's a big part of their learning too. And now it's time for them to communicate their conclusions and sometimes, not every time, but often, we hope, take some sort of informed action about it. So you can see this is the final rationale, excuse me, from the C3 framework. That the first three dimensions work as that pathway again for the final dimension. We're helping students communicate and act upon what they learn. This is what we think of really as good citizenship. And as stated in this rationale, most importantly, students must possess the capability and commitment to repeat this process of active engaging in learning, inquiring, coming up with a thought, supporting our opinion with some evidence. We want them to be able to do this as often and as long as necessary. If it's just within that same piece of learning, that same unit of learning, or what we're teaching again is a life skill. Every time something's put in front of me, I need to think about my habits of mind, my thinking processes. So how do we get them to do this? First of all, and I think we've talked about this from inquiry, the first part of the inquiry arc, The tasks we put in front of them at the end have to feel relevant and engaging to the students. It has to be some sort of authentic application and sharing of knowledge at the end. And it doesn't have to be big. Sometimes we think that sounds really daunting, but they can share within the classroom. That's relevant and engaging, right? Sharing with our peers. They can share within the school. They could go, if they're a fourth grade class, they can go share their information in some way with a kindergarten class. They could put posters up around the school of something that they felt was important for everyone to know. And sometimes that can go beyond the community. Can they take what they've learned and apply it to improving something in their own community or making their community aware of something? And again, we want students to have a voice in this work, but we still need to provide the guidelines for the projects that they may take on. We have to establish a clear evaluation rubric. We need to share that with the students from the beginning of the project so they know what the expectation is. And finally, we want to give students those opportunities always. I know it's hard virtually, but we can do it. We want to give them opportunities to work as a whole group, in small groups, and individually so that they can express and organize their ideas. So summarizing again in the classroom can look different depending on the grade level, depending on the project. For our younger students, it can be as easily as drawing. It doesn't have to be all writing. So for example, our grade 1 students could listen to the Star Spangled Banner, and then they could sketch an image that represents the song. They've summarized the Star Spangled Banner in an image. They're summarizing their learning. In our grade 4 class, they can do an argument. They can construct an argument. They can give a detailed outline. They can create a poster. A poster is an argument. They can even create an essay for us that discusses the compelling question that they covered, that shows some specific claims and relevant evidence from those historical and contemporary sources. And this is where it gets a little more challenging for our older students, that last part, while we acknowledge competing views. It's okay to disagree, but if we're truly going to construct an argument, we always want to note what the opposing view is, but we want to, again, teach our students to say why their side might be a better option. Now, when we think about what taking informed action looks like, again, our first graders could have fun with this. After studying this unit about what makes us all Americans, we could ask students to plan and present a class museum of U.S. history. Wouldn't that be great? And wouldn't it be fun to invite other classes to come see your living history museum? That's a way that they can take informed action. They are now taking their knowledge and sharing with others. That's good citizenship. In our grade 4, they could have a class deliberation about the history of slavery. And they could be memorialized and how it could be memorialized in their community. They could write a class proposal then. Here's where they could really take that action out in an authentic way. They could send it to the mayor or other stakeholders suggesting how to memorialize, again, slavery in their history, in their community. So that's one example of how they could take their knowledge and share at either the school level or the community level. All right, so we've started thinking about in webinars is the struggles that we often face when we think, well, this is a lot, it sounds exciting and I'd love to do this, but ooh, it's kind of daunting. Well, first of all, it might be sort of daunting as a virtual learning experience. That's something we're all either doing virtual or blended learning. That can be a daunting thing to overcome. Finding the grade level primary and secondary sources comes up as a task sometimes. That's a struggle. There are a lot of great things out there, but they're too adult for our little kids to read. What about just developing these inquiries? That's a lot of work. And, you know, everything we know. Teachers never have enough time in their day anyway, and this is time consuming. How do I find the time not only to develop them, but to get them worked into the classroom setting? So let's just, again, do brainstorming ideas to kind of help us through these struggles. So when we think about virtual or blended learning considerations, and you think about, well, how are my kids going to collaborate online, or how are they going to do research or communicate their conclusions? These are all different tools that are available out there that you may be familiar with and maybe already be using in your class. Others that you may consider. So for collaborative spaces, again, Zoom breakout sessions. My district uses Microsoft Teams more than Zoom. And in Microsoft Teams, I know that they are, even as we speak, getting ready to create breakout sessions that are easy to navigate for teachers and students too. So that's coming. Learning how in the Microsoft Teams class notebook, every class notebook in Microsoft Teams has a collaborative space. So every child has private spaces in the notebook that nobody but the teacher and student can see, but there are collaborative pages where everybody can share and work. And Modo's another one, and Yammer. And evaluating resources and research. Again, for our youngest students, instead of sending them out into the wide web, it's probably better for you to go ahead and curate those for now to guide their learning. We're going to keep them focused and where we know that things have, we trust the sources that we're putting in front of them. Again, I would take them to that Library of Congress or the National Archives. Amazing things there. And communication tools. You know, how do we want the kids to communicate with each other, with us? How do we want them to summarize and put things out there? If you've been using PowerPoint for a long time and you want to teach your students how to use PowerPoint presentations, that's great. I have been learning a lot about Nearpod and using Nearpod because it becomes an interactive, engaging PowerPoint presentation. So that's another layer you can add on there. Or Glogster and even Storyboard, fun ways for them to communicate what they've learned. And finally, again, taking that informed action. How can they share outside the classroom? They can do it virtually, or they can do it physically. They can take that Nearpod, they can take that Storyboard, and they can share it in places that you trust. Again, finding those grade level primary sources, that's always a concern that comes up. National Archives, Library of Congress, and Docs Teach. Great places for you to look and find ones that are already leveled for you by grade. So you don't have to look at everything about the Civil War. You can search for your grade level and know that it's going to work for you. So developing inquiries. Again, if you haven't done it before and you're just tiptoeing in, I would recommend going to the c3teachers.org website and using their inquiry design model. If you want to build one from scratch, there's a blank template just like this, and you can see it has all the components we've talked about, the compelling question, the supporting questions, the tasks that we want to see along the way to know that they're getting the learning done, where you're going to put your sources. This is yours, by the way. This is your lesson plan. This isn't for the student's view. And where you, again, your summative performance task and you're taking informed action, all right there on one nice document. Do you have to start from scratch? Absolutely not. First of all, you can always look at your current curriculum and the instructional delivery of those standards and ask yourself, you know, are there parts of this arc that are already happening? If they are, let me just plug those in, and then let me work backwards a little bit and think about, well, what's missing? What do I need to do? So if I feel like maybe my content already had a great compelling question, and maybe it even had some great supporting questions, but what it was lacking was the sources beyond the textbook, or it was lacking the performance task or the informed action at the end. So take what you know and build on it. And again, use this template or others that are out there that make that organization easier for you. That's sometimes the struggle, is putting it on paper yourself. Again, it's a lot. It can be daunting. It's time consuming. So my suggestion is, as you're first starting, don't go reinvent the wheel. There are places out there like the C3 Teachers website or Docs Teach, where you can find already fully developed inquiries. You could take those inquiries, then at first, if you want to just present them and work with them the way they are, that's a great place to start. If you see one that you like, but you're not 100% sold on it, then put your own stamp on it. There's nothing that says that you can't take what you find and make it your own. Always do that. And then again, if you just want to start with, I don't even know how to start with a compelling question, there's a great place called History Tech, and there are hundreds of sample compelling questions on there. And some of those are there just to spark your inquiry, your mindset. Finally, if you think about where you're going to start, how you're going to get going on this, knowing that sometimes, unfortunately, our social studies time gets very little time in our school day, right? Where do we want to start? I think it's important to take a moment to realize that it's a growing process for students and teachers alike. This image accompanies this great excerpt from a book called Inquiry Mindsets, Nurturing the Dreams and Wonders and Curiosities of Our Youngest Learners. And it's a great, I think, visual of describing the scaffolding of student inquiry. I think if you're just beginning and your students are just beginning, you're down here on the left side of the pool in the structured inquiry. The students are following the teacher as the entire class engages in just one inquiry together. That's an amazing start. And you can see as we move through, the students begin to answer the questions and the teacher chooses the topic. It's still controlled. Then you see that our swimmers are starting to go on their own in the guided inquiry. The teacher chooses the topic and questions, but the students get to design the product or the solution. So you're letting them wade deeper and deeper on their own until they're finally down there in the deep end. You're out there around the perimeter, monitoring, guiding, making sure nobody's drowning out there. We don't want our students in creative struggle for too long. But by the time you get to free inquiry, that's where your students are actually choosing their own topics without reference to any prescribed outcome. That's a big learning curve for us. So if this year we get inquiries done entire year, that's okay. You don't have to do one a week, one a month, one a quarter. It's kind of where it's going to fit for you. How comfortable are you? Where are you starting? And where do you think you'd like to finish the year? So as we wrap it up, if you want to share in the chat where you think you might start, maybe you've already done some of this structured inquiry and you're moving ahead. And where do you think you'd like to finish the year?